America just hit 40 trillion dollars in debt. Yeah, not million, trillion dollar in debt. And you might be thinking like, so what? That's government problem, I guess. Not really. Because when America borrows more money, someone has to lend it. And when investor demands higher interest to lend it money, borrowers get more expensive. Borrowing get more expensive, I guess. Yeah, that means higher mortgage rates, more expensive car loans, more expensive business loans, bigger interest bill for the government. And here's is the really crazy part: America isn't going to wake up tomorrow and pay off the $40 trillion. Going to keep refinancing it. So the question really is, who actually owns the American debt? Why is the government now spending roughly $1 trillion a year just on interest? Yeah, that's just on interest. And what happens to your money if the cost of borrowing just keeps really going up? Let's follow the 40 trillion and find out who pays it. Let's just start with the almost everyone. Let's start with the question almost everyone gets wrong. Like, who does America actually own all this money to? If you're like most people, you probably thought of like one country first. It's like China. That's not actually how this works. America doesn't own $40 trillion to a one country. It doesn't even most of it to a foreign government. $40 trillion actually is split into two major buckets. About $8 trillion, or roughly 20%, something called intra-governmental debt. That sounds complicated. It's actually pretty simple if I say that. It's the money the federal government owns to other parts of the federal government, including trust funds such as Social Security. Then you have roughly $32 trillion in debt held by public, and here it where it gets like really interesting. Foreign governments and international investors hold around $9.35 trillion of the publicly held debt, and that's roughly 24%. So more than three quarters of the public city held portion is essentially owned by people and institutes outside foreign governments, banks, pension funds, and mutual funds, insurance companies, Federal Reserve, the American investors, retirees. So when you hear America owns $40 trillion, don't picture one giant check sitting on China's desk. Picture a massive web of investors and institutes holding US Treasury securities. And that leads to a much bigger questions. Why does America keep borrowing all this money in the first place? Because if government keep issuing debt, somebody has to keep buying it. Let's make it simple. Imagine you make like 1,100 grand a year, but you spend 130. You are really short 30, and so you have literally have two choices. First is spend less, versus spend less, borrow the difference. And that's basically what the government does. In fiscal year 2026, the government is projected to spend roughly $7.4 trillion, but it's expected to collect only around $5.6 trillion in revenue. That leaves a gap of about nearly $1.9 trillion, and that gap is in the deficit you see. The question is, the government spends more time, more than it collects, and cause a deficit, and because of deficit, you could see the increasing of borrowing, and and that's why the more debt is government is accumulating, and that's pretty simple thing. But here's what things got really uncomfortable, because you might say like, okay, uh, fine, just cut the spendings, and that's a really nice thing if it's the home, not your government spending and social security, very good. And the problem it is, which cut spending you do, like social security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, something else, because a huge proportions of the federal budget isn't made of a random purchases that can simply switch out tomorrow. And there's another problem. The government isn't just running a deficit after paying interest. It also called a primary deficit. In simple terms, that means that government is spending more than it collects, and because even counting the interest on its existing debt. So even if you magically remove the interest bill, the budget would simply still be in the red. That's a huge region. The debt keeps growing. It isn't just the America has an old debt. The current budget itself doesn't balance, and that's important because now the question becomes: if America keep borrowing $1 trillion, does it actually pay that money back? And this is where the government debt actually really different from your credit card. If you own a credit card company $5,000, eventually that company wants its money. Government debt work differently. The treasury issues bills, notes, bonds. Investor buy them. The government get the cash, and eventually those securities mature. And now here's the part that surprised many people. When an old treasury matures, the government doesn't necessarily need to permanently eliminate the debt. It can issue a new debt, and a new investor provide the money. That money can be used to repay the old investor. It's like a scheme of like, that. Then the government owns the new investor. So the old treasury measures and the new treasury issued, new investor provides money, and after the old investor get paid. It's like a Ponzi scheme you have seen, okay? And the debt is refinanced. That's all a fucking line of scam. That's why government debt is better than thoughts of a giant refinancing operations. The operation maturity of a US debt is roughly 71 months or just under 6 years. And in 2025 alone, more than $7.3 trillion in treasury securities are rolled over. So no, America isn't sitting there and thinking, how are we gonna find $40 trillion tomorrow? It continuously refinancing the basis of that debt, which sounds pretty manageable until you ask the question, what happens when the refinancing gets more expensive? And and that's where the story get really serious. Like the interest bill. This is probably the most important part of the entire video because the scary thing is about $40 trillion isn't really the number. It's the cost of carrying it. Think about a mortgage. If you borrow a 300 grand at a very low price, the payment might be manageable. Low rate, it might be manageable. If the exact same 300 grand has to be defined as a much higher rate, suddenly the debt becomes dramatically very expensive. America is dealing with the same basic problem. For years, the government borrowed at just low rates and cheap debt and really cheap money and cheap financing. But now some of the old cheap debt is nearly maturing, and when it gets replaced with a new debt at a today's higher rate, the interest bill grows like it has grown dramatically. The net interest cost went from around 345 billion in 2020 roughly 252 billions in 2025. And for fiscal year 2026, the net interest bill is projected to reach about nearly $1 trillion. That's one fucking $1 trillion just to serve the debt. According to the data we are using, interest cost have surpassed Medicare's and national defense, making the interest second largest federal expenditure after social security, and consumes nearly 20% of federal tax revenue. Think about that, what it means. Imagine if paycheck arrives before you buy groceries, before you buy a portrait, before you do anything else, and almost one if the money is already spoken for. That's basically the problem. And almost one if the money is already spoken for. That's basically the problem the government is facing. And there's something else that important. If even if America doesn't borrow another dollar tomorrow, if it has to refinance old debt at a higher rate, the interest will can still increase because the debt problem isn't just how much do we own. It's basically how expensive the debt. Yeah, it's expensive. How is the debt becoming? And now we can finally connect this back to you. Why interest rates matter to you? Like you might be thinking, okay, that's Washington problem. Why should I care? Because the cost of borrowing doesn't live in an isolated corner of the country. The treasury yield sits underneath a huge part of the financial system. As of August 2026, the 10-year treasury yield is around 4.67%, and the 30-year treasury is around nearly 5.20%. Now your mortgage doesn't simply equal the 10-year treasury yield, but the car loan isn't a treasury yield. Your business loan isn't either. Treasury help you establish the baseline cost of capital across the financial markets, and that means the chain can look like this: the government borrows more treasuries are issued. Investors decide what return they want, the long-term yield move, and other borrowing cost response. Mortgages, auto loans, business loans, corporate borrowings, that's all increase, and you generally pay more for that. And this is why the national debt can eventually become a personal finance issue. Remembering our housing example, a small change in mortgage rates can mean hundred of dollars more every month. The government doesn't directly set your mortgage rate, but the entire finance system is connected. So when borrowing costs stay high, money becomes more expensive. And if you own a home, want a home, run a business, need a car, or ever need to borrow money, you care about the price of the money, which means now we need to answer the other question. If America has to borrow trillion dollars, who keeps showing up to buy the debt? Like really, who buys all the debt? Someone has to buy treasury securities because America can just issue unlimited bonds into a empty room. Treasury auctions involve major financial institutes called primary dealers. Yeah, primary dealers. But those aren't that only buyers. The actual investors include pension funds, insurance companies, asset managers, banks, retirement funds, foreign central banks, and ordinary investors. So here's something important to understand. When someone's buy a treasury bond, they are effectively lending money to the US government. And historically, there has been a huge demand for the debt. And foreign demand has been changing. China has been reducing its treasury holding over time. Foreign investors now make up a smaller share of the overall debt, and that doesn't mean America suddenly can borrow. It means more of a treasury supply has to be observed by the domestic investors, which are nearly US banks, funds, retirement accounts and insurance companies and investors. And this creates another problem because buyers don't have to say we refuse to buy our American debt. They can simply say we will buy it but pay us more. And at $40 trillion, even a small increase in rate matters a lot. And what if investors really demand higher rates? Let's say I want to borrow $1,000 from you, and you agree to lend it at me at 3%, no problem. And then I come back and I want another $1,000, then another, then another. Eventually, look at me and go like, you're borrowing a lot of money, and I want a high return. That's the basic idea behind the risk of American faces. If America becomes more concerned about the government debt tragedy, they can demand a higher term premium. In normal way, pay me more because taking more risk by lending you for longer. And now you watch what happens. More debt equals to more treasury supply. More treasury supply equals investor demand, more return. And more return means yield rise. And borrowing gets more expensive. When borrowing gets more expensive, interest bill rises. And now you can potentially get a feedback loop. The government borrows more, the cost of borrowing rises. Interest takes up more of a budget, and deficit becomes harder to fix. The government needs to borrow more. Investor may demand even higher yield. And does it mean America is going to bankrupt tomorrow? No. That's not how this works. The United States issues debt. That's not how this works. The United States issues debt in its own currency. So the important question isn't, will America run out of like dollars? It's how expensive it will become. Keep the financing the government, and that brings us to the most popular supposed solution. Just print the money. And question we have like is, can America just print the money? America owns $40 trillion. Why not just create $40 trillion and pay it off? Problem solved. Yeah. Except money isn't wealth. The government can create dollars. It can't automatically create more houses, more food, more oil, more factories, more workers, or more products. Imagine the economy produce roughly like the same amount of goods and service, and suddenly there's dramatically more dollars chasing those goods. You haven't created more real wealth. You increase the amount of money. Company with same amount of stuff. That can create a really bad inflation. And so printing money doesn't make the economic cost disappear. It can make the cost more up. And instead of showing up as a government debt, it can show up through the purchasing power of currency. That's why there isn't a magic button. Eventually, policymaker face some combination of ugly choices. They have to do something like raises taxes, politically painful, cut spendings, also politically painful, or really like grow the economy faster than the debt. That sounds great, but unfortunately, you can't just order 5% economic growth and have it delivered tomorrow meeting. So there we arrived at the important discussions. Debt isn't automatically bad. It becomes dangerous when the numbers and the teeth really stop working. Like, but before we get there, there's another question I have. Like, who's actually pay for this? If you think about it, who actually pays for it? That's the real thing. Who actually pays for the $40 trillion? First, let's kill one misleading statistics. You sometimes see like $40 trillion American population, $120,000 per person. Then you own 120 grand. No, that's not how the government debt works. Nobody is mailing a $120 or $120,000 invoice. The burden shows indirectly. It can mean higher future taxes, reduced government services, higher borrowing costs, and persistent inflation. And something economists call a fiscal space. And here's the easy definition: fiscal space is basically how much room does the government have to respond when something goes horribly wrong. Imagine another pandemic, a war, a financial crisis, and a major natural disaster. In an emergency, the government may need to borrow a massive amount of money quickly. But if too much future revenue is already committed to serving existing debt, there's less flexibility. The cost of $42 trillion isn't necessarily you personally own 120 grand. The more accurate idea is the future resources are already committed, and that's much more important because all debt doesn't just affect today; it affects the choices the government have tomorrow. But now let's ask the question that prevents that video from becoming fear bait. Is $40 trillion automatically dangerous? Actually, no. And the reason behind is why. This is a part that get lost in most viral debt videos. The giant number doesn't automatically mean economic disaster. After World War II, the American debt to GDP ratio reached approximately 100%, 113% more. Uh, America didn't collapse; it grew, and that economic growth helped reduce the debt burden related to the size of the economy. So the important question isn't was $140 trillion too much? That's too simple. The better question is, can America economy grow fast enough compared with the cost of like servicing the debt? Imagine the company grows by 5% a year. The effective interest rate is debt is 22%. That's a much easier situation. The company isn't growing faster than the cost of debt. Imagine the company grows at 2% and the debt crossed nearly 5%. Now we actually got a much harder problem. The cost of servicing debt is growing faster than the economy supporting it. Supporting it. That's the basic idea behind the relation between RNG and interest rate and versus like economic growth. When the interest rate stays above growth for long term, the debt burden becomes harder to control. The problem isn't simply $1 trillion. It's high debt, weak growth, high borrowing cost, And that combination is what you need to watch. Now we can finally put the entire machine together. America spends more than it's collect, so it runs on a deficit. If you think the deficit require borrowing, and the borrowing creates like a more debt, and the more debt creates interest, and interest puts pressure on the budget, and the government refinance the old debt, and the new debt get issued. And if investor demand higher yield, the cost of defense rises, and the machine look like this. Spending is more like revenue, and there is a deficit, and the borrowing increases, and the more debt, and more interest, more fiscal pressure, more borrowing. That's what I want to remember. The $40 trillion number isn't the entire story. It is India, America doesn't need to pay $40 tomorrow. It can to keep refinancing as the debt get bigger. The small changes in interest rate becomes much more important. And a 1% point increase across the tens of billion dollars debt doesn't mean every dollar instantly reprices because the treasury receives mature at like different times. But as more debt rolls over into higher rates, the additional interest expense are eventually reach the hundred of billion of dollars a year. And that why this isn't just a Washington problem. It can affect nearly like it can affect your mortgage, it can affect your loan, um, business borrowing, government, so anything. The government ability to respond the next time something goes seriously wrong. So when you hear America's foreign debt, don't ask is a 40 trillion a lot, or ask who owns it? Why does America keep borrowing? How is the debt being refinanced? Who is buying the next treasury? What happens if investor demands higher rates? And finally, that how much will be the next trillion cost? Because that's the real question. Not can America pay $400, but how much will the next trillion cost? And thank you if you watched. If you like the video, just do like it and just subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.